And good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here and to see you all. Welcome to everyone, and a special welcome to our guests tonight, two very special men, David Gergen and Warren Olney. Tonight, we'll be hearing about David Gergen's theory of how leaders are made. The subject of his recently released book, Hearts Touched with Fire. It's fabulous. I highly recommend it. Here it is. We have provided a link to the book in our emails. In the final part of the book, David gives a list of 20 takeaways, lessons or tips for emerging leaders to follow. The final takeaway actually applies to both of our guests here tonight. And I'm going to quote, "A person who invests a lifetime giving back to others needs a serious dose of idealism to stay the course." And then quoting from George Washington, he writes, "Labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. Thank you both for your idealism and for your conscience and for joining us tonight." America at a Crossroads is a joint venture between Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. Thanks, as always, to our leadership team, which includes former Congressman Mel Levine, Zev Yaroslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chazen, Caroline Kelly, David Lehr, and myself. Next week, we are excited to present Republican political strategist and publisher of the conservative news and opinion website, The Bulwark, Sarah Longwell. Longwell has dedicated her career to fighting the takeover of the GOP. Her words. She will be in conversation with writer and political commentator Bill Kristol. The Wednesday after Labor Day, we will welcome former acting Solicitor General of the United States, the brilliant Neil Katyal, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post journalist Carol Leonig. There are not two more brilliant and informed people who can discuss the future of our democracy and help us understand what is at risk. So thank you for signing up for all of our programs and for not unsubscribing, or you will not get our links. So be sure you don't unsubscribe inadvertently to our emails. Now I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague and joint venture in this project, David Lehr. David?
Thank you, Janice. After over 110 sessions of this series, one would think we might run out of topics that would draw thousands of viewers to their computers on a midsummer evening, but that's not the case. At a time when questions about leadership and who is fit to lead occupy our headlines, we have a guest tonight who has been in the presence of leaders as few others have, David Gergen. His return dialogue with Warren Olney promises to be enlightening. In addition to the programs that Janice mentioned, in September, we have a series of blockbuster programs with some important headline makers. On September 14th, we host Cecile Richards, the former head of National Planned Parenthood, to discuss the very real threats to reproductive rights that abound today. She'll be in dialogue with the LA Times' Pat Morrison. Richards, by the way, is the daughter of the legendary former governor of Texas, Ann Richards. The following week, we host Lawrence Tribe, one of the leading minds in American jurisprudence, who will discuss the threats to our democratic structures with UC Irvine law professor and former LA Times journalist Henry Weinstein. And there's more around the corner, including the highly regarded legal scholar of Harvard's Lawrence Tribe. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the host of tonight's program, a pillar of serious news reporting in Los Angeles and Southern California for decades, the winner of countless awards for excellent journalism, KCRW's Warren Olney. Warren?
Hi, David, and thank you so much for introducing me to this extraordinary panel of people that you have had and continue to have, including David Gergen. It is my pleasure and privilege to be able to talk to you, David, and thanks a lot for being with us. Quick introduction, David Gergen served as a senior White House advisor to 4 U.S. presidents, Nixon, Reagan, Ford, and Clinton, Republicans and a Democrat. He was also senior advisor to Clinton's Secretary of State, Warren Christopher. He currently is a political commentator, serving as senior political analyst for CNN. He's also had a journalistic career since he left the White House. He is now founding director of the Center for Public Service at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he is an author. His book, Eyewitness to Power, was a bestseller. And the latest one, I'll hold it up too, is once again, Touched with Fire, how great leaders are made. Hearts Touched with Fire, excuse me for mangling the title of the book, David, but it's great to be with you, and thanks a lot for doing this.
Thank you. It's a terrific honor to be with you. I gather, Warren, looking over your life, you've had some 40 national and local awards for your work in journalism. That's quite extraordinary. I don't think I've ever met anybody with that many awards, but I'm really impressed, and thank you.
Well, I worked at a radio station where they were really good at the applications, and so it worked to my benefit tremendously.
Sure, and Thank you, Janice, and thank you, David.
I want to get into the issues that you raise and the people that you talk about as leaders. But before we do, let me just ask you why you wrote this book. Let's start there.
Well, I wrote this book, I think it was sort of pulled out of me by events around me. And for the last 20 years, I have moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts. In part, I went there to the Kennedy School to join the faculty. But I also went with a sense of disappointment about our leadership and growing concern about our quality of our leadership in Washington, D.C. And I thought the best way I can perhaps make a contribution is to work with the younger generation, those who haven't yet been fully, taken in by the politics and haven't been sort of turned off by the poisonous quality of our politics. So this book is really an appeal to the younger generation. Keep minds open. This is going to be your country. You really need to get in and fight for the right things. You shouldn't be on the sidelines waiting. It's not going to come to you. Every generation has to prove itself. And the days are here very quickly. I think in the next few years, they're going to be rough years. But I think it's time for a passing of the torch from the older generations to Gen X, as well as the millennials and Gen Z. I think the best hope for the future of this country rests with new generations. We have fresh blood, fresh idealism, fresh energy, and aren't swamped by the controversies of the past.
I want to get to your recommendations to people and also who you admire. I should say that the book begins with Greta Thunberg in Sweden, and it ends with Teddy Roosevelt. So there's a range of options in leadership.
Sure.
That is pretty broad that you have covered. But you are unstinting with the current generation of leaders, as you just suggested that you are. And you say that there's been a series of massive leadership failures, that after World War II, we were the strongest nation since Rome. Since that time, we're now 10th or 20th when it comes to issues of daily life. And we're talking about civil war and the risks of losing democracy. So what happened? What was this series of incorrect decisions or disastrous decisions, I guess would be a better term?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure that anybody has the full answer. But I would argue that there has been a generational change that's been significant and not for the better. When I went to Washington back in the late 60s, early 70s, the city was run by the World War II generation. And by that, I mean those young men and women who were essentially wore a uniform during World War II, came out after the war, decided they helped to save the world already. Now they wanted to save the United States. And they became a terrific generation in rebuilding America from the ground up. And when they left, by the time they left, they weren't perfect. It is really worth remembering that they brought us Vietnam and Watergate. But if you look at the totality of what they accomplished, they left behind the United States that was still unchallenged as a major power. And we basically, because we're winning the Cold War. But we also they left behind an America that was the strongest nation since ancient Rome in terms of economic power, military power, cultural power. It was a time of I think in the mid 40s on to the mid 60s, I think one of the golden ages of American life. That said, they started leaving the stage. World War II generation started leaving the stage a few years ago. That's become more of a swelling now. There are a lot of them gone, but we haven't passed the torch in the right way because we still have the baby boomers to contend with. And the baby boomers were the chief successors to World War II generation. And the baby boomers, there are many fine individuals who are baby boomers. They've done a lot for the country. They are to be praised. But as a group, as a generation, I'm afraid to say that the baby boom population or generation has been a disappointment, as opposed to sort of leaving a country that is the strongest since ancient Rome. As you say, Warren, yeah, we're 10th, 20th, 25th on many measures, economic excellence or educational excellence. We used to have one of the most literate societies in the world. People would stand on the docks in New York City waiting for the next chapter of a Charles Dickens novel to arrive, because people were thirsty for information and learning. And we've lost a lot of that. And I think it's time to rebuild it, but it's going to take a concerted effort to get there. But if you want to know what went wrong, I think that we unfortunately lost the leadership. We couldn't maintain it much longer for the World War II generation. And we simply haven't found the successor generation that I think has the match of what we've seen before.
Let me ask you some very specific questions about decisions that even go back further than you're suggesting. Max Boot has a column this week, and it's an interesting one. It was distributed to our viewers, and that's one of the reasons that I'm asking about it. And incidentally, viewers, you can communicate your questions to David Lehrer, and he will send them to me by text, and I will ask some of those later on in the program. So I'm not going to be the only one asking questions today. You can do it too. But David, Max Boots said that President Ford, for whom you worked,
yes,
having pardoned Richard Nixon, for whom you
yes,
also worked,
yes,
said that that was a historic mistake and that it has created the expectation of criminal impunity for both sitting and former presidents. And it has led Republicans, led of course by former President Trump, to be outraged over the Department of Justice doing what it should, according to Max Boot, which is pursuing the president and any possible crimes that he may have committed.
Yeah.
Is that one of those disastrous decisions that led up to where we are today?
Well, I must say, I have enormous regard for Max Boot. He's been a long time conservative. He's been a principled conservative. He got turned off by the Trump team several years ago. He's gone into strong opposition against the Trumpsters and the radicals who have taken over the Republican Party. And he writes, he has an acerbic quality sometimes about his writing. He gets straight to the point, which I like and admire. And I've gone to see him to have coffee. I wanted to meet him and get to know him, and we talk from time to time. But in any event, I don't agree with him about President Ford. I think President Ford was, at the moment I was working for him, and I must tell you, his presidency was totally dominated. He had economic problems. There were international problems. There were problems in the Cold War that he was trying to deal with, and yet almost every waking hour for several weeks was being taken up by trying to figure out what to do about Richard Nixon, who was in exile and wanted to be pardoned and all the rest of it. Finally made the decision, to my surprise. I was one of those people, I remember hearing about it on a Sunday morning that Ford was going to pardon Nixon. I was driving with my wife to church, and we almost damn near went off the road when I heard about the pardon. It was such a surprise, and I was working at the White House, but it was very much a very small group of people made that decision. And at the time, he really got hurt for it. Ford paid a big price. He lost the next election primarily because of that. So I have sympathy for that. But here's the interesting point, Warren, that it was the John F. Kennedy Library, which gives an annual award for courage, for political courage, gave one year. President Ford had died by this time, but they gave the Kennedy Library gave their award in courage in the name of Gerald Ford, because they thought he had done the right thing. And I think there's a world of difference between the effort by Ford to do the right thing versus the Trump people to do exactly the wrong thing. They want to take the radicals hostage in the Republican Party. Look at the way they're beating up on Liz Cheney today. There's no, I don't know. There seems to be no satisfying the anger and exhaustion and whatever that's coming from the right, and I think has swept across the country.
You also worked for Ronald Reagan, and he had a famous 11th commandment, which was never speak ill of another Republican. Yep. That doesn't work anymore, as you just suggested. Sure. Liz Cheney is denounced by the former president. She won big 2 years ago when she ran for Congress, and now all of a sudden she gets clobbered by Trump's candidate?
She's another candidate for profiling courage. Because she gave up her career. In effect, I mean, she was number 3 in the leadership. She was likely to be the first woman, on the Republican side to become the leader over time. It was a matter of time. She was very well regarded, but she put principle over politics and her own personal welfare. And as you know now, she's being threatened. I mean, she's getting serious threats to her well-being. There are people that have to get her for doing that. But I think that it bespeaks badly of where we are as a people right now, that a Liz Cheney can't step forward, almost like a Margaret Chase Smith of Maine did way back in the McCarthy period, and really brought down McCarthy. That it's really, really hard for Liz Cheney or anybody else like that to bring down some of the people around Trump.
How are leaders in the Republican Party, or young people that you want to address on this program and in your book, who want to be leaders of the Republican Party, how are they going to overcome this and overcome the charisma of Donald Trump, who seems to have simply taken possession of the party and its elected officials, with a couple of exceptions?
Well, I must say the Republicans are not offering a lot of peace pipes to their brethren. There were 10, as I recall, there were 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump. And 10 Republicans in the House of Representatives who voted to impeach Donald Trump. We are now up to 8 who are not coming back.
Yeah.
They either retired because it was just, they didn't want to put up with it anymore, or they lost primaries, as did Liz Cheney. And we're going to wind up with 8 or 9 of them. That sends a terrible message, of course, to the younger generation about, especially young Republicans, about what you have to do if you want to rise in this new environment that they've created. I must tell you, the people I think, and I do think, and I want to, along the way here, when there are things we can say that are positive about the future that provide hope, I think we should speak up about it. And I do think that one of the things I'm most hopeful about is that there are, just as we saw in World War II, we saw terrific veterans come home and run for office. Class of 46, Republican class swept out the New Dealers, brought in Richard Nixon. But the point of all of this is that the veterans came back from World War II on both sides of the aisle, got very involved. And when I went to Washington, as I say, the place was run by a lot of the World War II veterans. And as many as, when I was in Washington in those early days, we had as many as 75% of the members of Congress were veterans. Today it's around 15%. And that makes a real difference, Warren, in terms of the culture of the place. I'm very involved with a group called With Honor. It's a nonprofit. I'm chairman of the advisory board, for full disclosure. But we've been trying to identify, recruit, train, and help in their efforts to win veterans on both sides of the aisle. You have to be someone who takes a pledge to work with the other side. There's an effort here to rebuild the middle of American politics. And we've had now some 30 people who joined up in Congress. I don't know the latest number, given what the swirl that's going on now, but it's done very well. And some of them are actually being booted now because they do come from purple areas, but they're in there, like the Adam Kinzingers of the world. We're speaking up, and they're doing a good job with it, and they're increasingly being listened to. So I'm hopeful about that. I think the veterans are not the only ones whom we should welcome into the public arena, but they're one clear group of people whom I think can make a difference. What
about the ending the draft, and the fact that now so few people are fighting the wars that have been called endless wars, starting with Vietnam, then Iraq, Afghanistan, which are very unpopular. They don't bring a nation together, as has been the case was the case certainly during World War II. Was that a mistake? Should we in some way require national service? Would that be a way to create more leaders?
It's not the alternative that I would urge. Instead, I think we have seen that people who go give a year or two back for the country in military uniform, most of them turn out to be terrific citizens. Not all of them, by the way.
Sure.
There's some toughies and people like that you don't want on your team. But there's been an honorable tradition among veterans to go and run and try to help the country. And what I think we need, I'm increasingly an advocate for something called national service. National service is an idea that goes all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt. When he would, you'll recall this. Now you weren't there, but before you get your first,
Thank you.
no less. And I wasn't far apart from you. Anyway.
I wasn't that far either.
just know that you're sure. But nonetheless, Roosevelt was elected in 1932, as you know. He was inaugurated in March of 1933. Within a few weeks of being inaugurated, he went public with a call for the creation of what he called the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the old CCC. He proposed that in the spring of 1933, wherein by that summer, there were 250,000 young men in the parks and the woodlands of this country, repairing them, replenishing them, who were the CCC volunteers. They weren't drafted. They volunteered. They got paid for it. Not much, but they got modest amount. They had a job as a result. It was one of the most popular programs in the Roosevelt period. It went on all the way up to the beginnings of World War II. And I think the time is ripe now for something similar on the civilian side, not the military side. We've got enough people in the Army now. And you don't want to overload the Army with people you don't need. It doesn't need. What we do need, what we should have, is an alternative to Army service, and that is civilian service that you can work and give a year back. Let me just give you an example. Many of you from LA. Now, I had a conversation yesterday with Austin Butner, who has been leading the charge for an initiative, and you know more about this than I do, an initiative voters will vote on in November to create up to $1 billion a year, a fund of $1 billion a year for public schools for the arts and music, something that has disappeared from many of our public schools to our chagrin and our regret. This is a terrific idea. And they're looking for, they're trying to figure out also how to have more people teach early childhood education, reach that. And we had a good conversation. I said, why don't you link it up with the national service? Why don't you see if you can't get a lot of people to go work in the schools, work on these arts and programs, work on these music programs for basically, very little money, but they can take a year, give back to their community. We're talking, you guys are running a community-oriented organization that you really understand that to change the culture, to change the country, we have to change the culture from the ground up. And people who are committed to the life of their communities are going to be a saving grace of the future. So if you're a young person, I would encourage I wouldn't require, but I would encourage every young person between 18 and 24, maybe a little bit earlier, maybe a little later, but essentially 18 to 24, and say, hey, come work for a year. If you work for a year in schoolhouses, for example, or in hospitals or in places like that, or indeed in the woods, if you do that for a year, we'll knock a year's debt off your college debt. And if you've been raised in urban America, we're going to give you a chance to go work in rural America, and vice versa. People who've been raised in the farmlands of this country, they need to go look at what it's like in the cities these days, how dangerous it can be and that sort of thing. So I think there's enormous merit, and I also believe there are a lot of kids who will sign up for it. The Peace Corps gets a lot more requests to serve even now than it has positions. And I think the same thing can be true. There is honor in serving the country, whether you're in a military uniform or whether you're in a civilian uniform. The point is to give back to the country, because I think those people from that will come a commitment to the quality of life in this country and to the brotherhood of people who live in this country.
One of the people you just mentioned, of course, is Franklin Roosevelt, and let's take a quick look at him as somebody who had characteristics that you admired. And you quote Oliver Wendell Holmes as saying that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a second-class intellect, but a first-class temperament.
Yes,
That's pretty interesting.
that is interesting. It occurred shortly after Roosevelt was inaugurated, 2 or 3 days later. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. Was 91, 92 years old. He was about to leave the court, been appointed by Teddy Roosevelt, about to leave the court. And FDR went over to say happy birthday to him. I think he lived in Georgetown. And they had coffee together. And as Roosevelt left, Holmes turned to an associate and said of Roosevelt, a second-class mind, but a first-class temperament. I've always been interested in that because I think it's got it the right way around. When I was growing up, I didn't think that. My dad was a mathematician, and so there tended to be a family tradition of looking for the smartest person in the group. And I always thought the smartest person would make the best leader. Well, then I went to Washington and I discovered it ain't so. Give me a person with a good head on her shoulders, but a person who has got a really good sunny temperament, and I'll show you somebody who can be a leader. And I think the temperament issue is one which we often overlook, but makes a difference. And a lot of people they like being liked, and a lot of our leaders are better when they're appreciated. One of the things that happened. Look back when Eisenhower was president in the 1950s. 8 straight years. President Eisenhower had an average approval rating, on average for 8 straight years, 64% approval. Now think about that. We haven't seen, today our president struggled to get to 50% approval. Joe Biden has been troubled by his numbers going all the way down to the high 30s. But Eisenhower, he was a war hero, but he was also, I like Ike. That was the message that came out. The button he had, I like Ike, was the most popular political button in history. And what it is, I like Ike, and it has a big picture of him smiling, just as, all the way up. He was a marvelous human being, and he could lead because of that. People followed him because they wanted him to succeed. Now we got people throw stones at who's ever in power. Because they don't match up. They're not good enough. They drink too much. They do this too much. They do that too much. We're making life very difficult for leaders to succeed. It's very, very hard to succeed these days, I'm afraid. That's why I have admiration for people, even though we may disagree with them. I have admiration for people who are willing to get in the arena for what they believe.
You talk about the tough challenges that leaders will always have to face, and in some times, they will have to do things that perhaps they don't want to do.
Sure.
You compare Eisenhower with Donald Trump in the following way. Donald Trump, according to the Washington Post, lied some 36,393 times or something like that, whereas Eisenhower did have to lie a couple of times, despite what you just said.
It's such a good point. Such a good point. Here was the deal. Eisenhower, for most of his presidency, he had 2 terms. Through his first term and pretty much into his second term, was known for his honesty. Then we had the U-2, it was an airplane, it was a reconnaissance plane that Francis Gary Powers, the pilot, was piloting, and was shot down out of the skies over Russia. It was out on one of the last reconnaissance missions over Russia, shot down. Everybody assumed that Powers, the plane had been lost, been destroyed, had been lost, and that Powers had died. He had been given, I think, a vial of poison to take in the event before he got captured because he was an intelligence guy. But he miraculously survived, as did the plane survived. Eisenhower went to the country and said it was a weather plane. It wasn't a reconnaissance plane, and the pilot died. And so forth. He didn't know it. Eisenhower didn't know it, but he was telling the country a lie. It wasn't true. What he had to say wasn't true. I'm sorry, he did know that he was telling a lie, but the country didn't know he was telling a lie. Well, when the lie was exposed, Khrushchev, who was a Soviet leader, held Powers off the air, held the plane off the air. Once Eisenhower made a public commitment to what he said was the truth, then Khrushchev sort of rolled back the curtain and said, aha, here's Powers, and there's the plane. We told you all along those Americans were cheating and so forth. That was a devastating blow for Eisenhower internally. He wanted to be known for his honesty. he went to a couple of his best friends and asked if he should resign. Asked if he should resign over this one big lie that was unintentional. And they persuaded him, no, please don't do that, which he did not. But nonetheless, think about how different that is from, as you say, Trump's approach to lying. And the 3,000, the numbers are just astonishing.
Let me ask you about some of the people that you actually find hope in, because
Sure.
I think, once again, that's what your book's about. And they include AOC,
Yes.
and Squad, and Black Lives Matter,
Yep.
and other advocates of what a lot of people think of as very radical change. And
Yep.
yet you also say in the book that you want to build from the center.
Yep.
These people aren't in the center, and I'm interested that you yet still see them as,
Okay.
as people ought to be studied by young people as examples.
It's a fair question, but here's what I honestly believe. We went through the 60s and 70s, civil rights, women's rights, and many other kinds of rights, with a lot of demonstrations in the field, the anti-war movement, the pro-women rights movement. All these things happened, and I remember the arguments that came up. Oh, these people are radical. They're way off to the left. The government's going to destroy things. You don't want to have any of these people anywhere near the government. And you know what? It turned out a lot of people in the streets were the right, were on the right side of the issue in the end of the day. They actually did believe in extending civil rights to African Americans. They did believe in taking on climate change. They did believe in doing things about Medicare and Medicaid. They were, and the people who were in the streets ultimately, I think, were to a significant degree vindicated. So my feeling right now is, hey, AOC's politics are not mine. You're going to have Bill Kristol in your community soon. Let's talk to him. He's a principled conservative. Yeah, I'm sure he rejects everything AOC stands for. I appreciate that. Black Lives Matter, they're to the left of me too. But I celebrate, because I think it's the right thing to do, I celebrate the fact that these young people in their 20s and 30s are getting into the arena and trying to produce change. We need that. We need that kind of debate. Debate is not a bad thing. Debate is a good thing. The question is what you do at the end of the debate. Are you willing to work together on compromises? And right now, the radicals just refuse any sort of compromise on the right and the left. But I have to tell you, some of my friends think I'm crazy, but I feel the only way we're going to solve this is if people across the spectrum can sit down with each other and essentially be committed as Americans to trying to get us out of this mess. And I think we're going to need everybody. We're not going to need just people on the middle. That's what I want to strengthen immediately. But I think these other people will play a valuable role over time. And I don't think we can succeed if we try to make this the only way to solve America's problems is to do the following three things, and we cannot deviate from any of that because that's our sacred vow. That is not where we ought to be. We ought to be, what does it take? How are we going to get there? Where are we going to find the money? How can we be honest with each other? And what rewards are there at the end of the day if we get this country cleaned up? And I think the rewards are going to be enormous, just look at what's going on in the climate to reverse that alone. People in California and near the Colorado River, they'll tell you now about, we're right on the edge in so many ways.
How would you profile a potential Republican leader now who could persuade other Republicans who hold office in many cases that there is a different mess than one that they think we have, and that we need to do something about it?
I'm not quite sure I understand.
What I want to know, you talk about AOC and others of the leftist persuasion. In order to get the Republican Party back on track, according to what I think you believe, how do you get young people to do that, young Republicans? What do you tell them? How do they approach their party and the people that lead it now?
I think that there've got to be rewards for being an independent voice like Liz Cheney or Adam Kinzinger, or you can think of a dozen more who've come in. There have got to be rewards for them in the system instead of being ostracized and thrown out if they split. You don't want to have the Cawthorns of the world, they're sort of on the radical right, being the only door into Republican political life. That the people who are representing the Republican Party today are unrecognizable compared to the people that I first went working there when I went to Washington. I mean, the people I found there when I first went in, even John Dean at the heart of Watergate. I mean, look at listen to him now. He's out quite middle of the road when he's on TV these days. But I worry, Warren, that we're going to repel young people from coming in. There were a couple of stories the last couple of days. The number of young people who are applying for or taking public jobs in government is sharply declining. There are a lot of young people who say, I don't need this mess. I don't want to get involved with it. It seems like it's all dirty. It seems like it's controlled by big money and all the rest of that stuff. That they've got to have a legitimate reason for feeling they can make the world a better place. If they won't come in otherwise. Same thing is happening in business, by the way. There's a big Deloitte study that shows a lot of college graduates, when they have an interview with a corporate company, they want to know whether that corporation is a good citizen. Where does it stand on climate? Where does it stand on women's rights? Where does it stand? And they won't go work for a company unless they think they're positive in their citizenship. And so they're getting pressure from the AOCs and others like that to clean up their act. And I think there are signs now that the business community is starting to come around. It's paying attention to these young people who don't want to come work for them unless they think they can hold their head up. And what you're seeing now, I just was the other night heard a conversation between Ken Chenault and Ken Frazier, two Black CEOs, major corporations. They are doing wonderful things together. There's a new thing called the 110 Project that Frazier and the two of them together really are pushing. And the idea of the 110 Project is to create 1 million jobs over the next 10 years for African Americans. And it's really aimed at, and there's a corporation are saying, we're going to go to work on this because we think it's serious. And we ought to be opening up job possibilities and job training for young people of color. The people who are at the bottom end of the totem pole frequently are these people of color. We have to recognize that, not hide from it. And by the way, I don't think we ought to have handouts. I have qualms about if you've been to college for 5 years and you have all these debts piled up, whether the government ought to stand in and just give you the money. I have qualms about that. I think it's far better off if we offer the people jobs that they can work for, and they can pay them a handsome salary. Let them work for it. I think it'll be better for everybody. And we're not in a position as people, frankly, we don't have a lot of free money to pass around.
I promised the listeners and viewers that they would be able to ask questions, and
Sure.
They have responded by sending some to David. And so let me start at the top with Roger.
Okay.
Roger wants to know, presumably you have read the book, Henry Kissinger's assessment of Richard Nixon in his new book.
I have the book. It's called Leaders, and it's about the 6 or 7 people that Kissinger had real influence on Kissinger. I was surprised, frankly, he had a chapter about Nixon. I wondered what he would do with that. I think he's very polite about it. He is. I would have to say, and Henry's 97 now, as you know. It's remarkable he even has a book. But the book it's not an easy read, but it's an interesting read. I have not read all of it. I've read portions of it. I think the piece of it that I'm quite pulled toward, that I find most compelling argument in the book, is that in the way we are dealing with the Russians and the Chinese, we seem to be hurtling towards some sort of potential showdown. And we don't, Henry Kissinger is basically saying, we don't have a strategy. We don't know what we're looking for out of this. We should not wander into a conflict without having a very, very thoughtful and deep understanding of why the hell we're going in and what we're going to get out of it. Because I mean, every day now you wake up and there's another little thing that happened that's a tick off the other side. And you wonder, why are we even letting these diplomats take these pot shots at each other? You know, we ought to be, instead of waking up to stories about tensions growing and, you know, over Taiwan, it ought to be negotiators sitting down in intense talks to see if they can't solve the problem.
Joe wants to know what president in the past 60 years, and once again, you worked for 4 of them, was the best leader?
No question about it, Franklin Roosevelt. American historians don't agree on a lot of things, but one thing they seem to agree on is that there were 3 really terrific presidents. One was Washington, the second was Lincoln, and the third was Franklin Roosevelt. One of the things you'll notice in there, it's been a long time since we've had a hero. It's been a long time, you know, it's been a long, long time since we lost FDR. It's 45, 55, 65 years now. So, 75 years, I think. And we need, I can't decide whether the thing we need is one person who's really a man on a white horse, the great man theory, or whether we need to change the culture. I tend to think we need to change the culture in order to find the people.
You mentioned the hero. You rely on Joseph Campbell a lot and his idea about the hero and the crucible. I won't go into it or ask you to go into it. I want to get back to our listeners, but it just they ought to know that if you read the book, you've got some stuff in there about Joseph Campbell.
I hope so. I've packed lots of stories in there, so it'll make it readable.
Yeah. So here's Pat. She wants to know, does the slash and burn attitude of the Republican post-Gingrich have a lot to do with our leadership? They seem cowed.
Yeah, Pat, perceptive question. Yeah, to go back to the generational point. Yeah, the World War II generation started leaving the stage, and much in the 1980s and certainly into the 1990s. Where was I going with this? What did Pat just ask me?
Pat wanted to know about the Republican post-Gingrich generation of leaders. Have they been the problem?
Thank you. So, in any event, who led the charge in the 90s to change everything on the Republican Party? It was Newt Gingrich, and he succeeded. Yeah. And he succeeded, first of all, in the House of Representatives, so that the House became, you know, with the number of veterans in the House declined rapidly, the House was more open to sort of bickering. And Gingrich really took hold of that and ran with it. And in 1994, that's when he basically, you know, moved in. It was the early part of the Clinton years. And he changed the world, because first Newt changed the House, the environment of the House. And then he changed, as people graduated from the House of Representatives to go run for the Senate, they brought that kind of partisanship, this brawling kind of partisanship, take no prisoners, you know. That migrated over to the Senate, and now it's migrated to the White House. And so the net result of all of that is that we have a much more contentious politics. Our democracy is under threat. This could still go either way. I always thought that the good guys are ultimately going to win this, but I'm not so sure.
So that's another one of those failed examples of failed leadership, or in this case, I guess.
Absolutely.
Okay. Ricardo wants to know, how can Liz Cheney best contribute going forward?
I think that she could take, and I think this is what she'll do. She take the high road, and be respectful of others who may disagree with you. After all, Liz Cheney is a staunch conservative. She's a principled conservative, just like Bill Kristol, and you know, others that you can see. There are some out there, And I think what she needs to do, I think what she can do, and she wants to do, is to ensure that she wants to make sure Donald Trump doesn't become president. I mean, that's her clear goal, and she's made it clear. I mean, there's no secret about it. And I think that what she could do is, if she can, she has the capacity now to command the national microphone. If instead of trying to be on the news every night, she spreads it out so that she's up there periodically, and you want to hear what she has to say, as opposed to, my God, I've heard it 10 times now. I think she can do a world of good in trying to lift the conversation in the country, to lift the discourse. And if she can do that, and if she has a following that comes out of that, I think then she could think about trying to run for the nomination of the party. I think it's extremely unlikely that Liz Cheney would win the Republican nomination. And we just look how the Republicans actually did vote yesterday, and that was they were 2-1 against Cheney, 2-1. It was a large loss. Yeah. It was not a close deal. Yeah. And I think if she could get to the primaries, like if she could get to New Hampshire and maybe Iowa and that sort of thing, she may have the capacity. If Trump feels he's got Liz Cheney on his left, and he's got Governor DeSantis of Florida on his right, who are both trying to pin him down, it could substantially weaken him as a candidate, or force him to go to one side or the other. I don't know how that's going to be, but I do think that Liz Cheney has done something that was gutsy. As I say, we haven't seen anything like this since Margaret Chase Smith going after McCarthy way back in the early 50s. Yeah. I think she's, I was thinking about this last night. Donald Trump will long be remembered. Liz Cheney is going to be long admired. And I think there's a difference.
Robert wants to know, has morality declined along with leadership?
Yes. I don't think it's disappeared. I think there are some individuals in this country who are very honest folk, good people. Many of them are religiously inspired, but times are changing. In the Christian faith, for example, the fastest rising group of individuals in Christianity are what are called the nuns, N-O-N-E, nuns. And that is, they have no religious foundation. They may be spiritual in nature, but they don't have a religious foundation. And I do think, and as you get older, you become to appreciate this more, that it makes a difference to have people in public life who are honest and spiritual, that have some anchoring. There's a hunger for that now. And, these are going to be the new profiles in courage. It's not going to be easy to get there. I come back to this point again and again. From my point of view, the next few years are going to be rough. It's going to be hard to govern the country, no matter who wins. And I have some fear, which I'm happy to talk about, that we're going to elect somebody who's in his 80s, which I think is a mistake. I'm much more hopeful about the long term, because I do think there are definite signs that many people in the younger generation are not going to put up with this much longer. They're going to fight for change. That's why I read about Greta Thunberg. That's why I talked about Malala internationally, but it's also true back here that in the Black Lives Matter movement, actually, I think that they're pursuing some important goals. And there are a lot of people who are signing up to be in the streets and to push their agendas. As I say, many of them are well to the left of me, but I cheer them on as they try to make their cases. Let's see if we can work our way through this and find a path out. And I think the young people can be major contributors to that. Yeah, the young people have so much at stake in these next 20 years. I mean, it's going to be their country. And if the country's a mess, they're going to pay a huge price for it. And the country we don't snap to on places, things like climate. Just look at the pictures that have come out in the last few days of all these rivers that are running dry, the lakes that are running dry, the Rhine River in Germany, they damn near had to shut it down. because it has almost no water in it. Things are tough right now, and we need to be honest about that and get on with fixing them.
Peter wants to know, why do you think Ukraine's President Zielinski is so effective?
Well, and I have to say that I think he does raise the question, where are our American Zelenskis? Why can't we find people like this? And I want to come back to that point. I think Zelensky connected because, frankly, I think coming out of the entertainment world, he understood how to reach people in a different way than most political figures do. He knew how to sort of get to their innards. He knew how he's good at sort of figuring out the emotional impact of what he's doing, and his bravery, putting himself in harm's way day after day, night after night, when they might well take him out with a drone strike, has been remarkable. So I think overall, Zelensky is a living example of what leadership is all about. If there were more Zelenskys, we'd be in a lot better shape. Now, there are people starting to nibble away at him. They're starting to sort of look at the foundations of his, there's been a lot of corruption in Ukraine over the years. And people are some of the critics are now starting to move in. They want us to get out of Ukraine or whatever. We dare not walk away from Ukraine as we walked away from Afghanistan.
Jeffrey wants to know, is there a chance, do you think, that a third party could become viable in this country?
I think we're closer to it now with the Liz Cheneys of the world. I was just in Aspen, Colorado about 10 days ago, and there was a meeting out there of people who were trying to start a third party. And some of them were, well-respected political types. And there wasn't flashy, but it was the beginnings. And I asked them, what are you out doing? They said, we're trying to start a third party. It seems unlikely, but we're in unlikely times.
Why is it unlikely?
So hard. When an effort was made like this in one of the last elections, one of the last recent presidential elections, with the third way and the different groups that were supporting change to a third party. They managed to get, that effort was the most serious that we've seen in recent years. They managed to get on the presidential ballot in almost every state, which was a big breakthrough. But then they looked around for someone to be the presidential candidate for this party and another person to be the vice president. And they wanted the Democrat to be the president, the Republican to be the vice president, or vice versa, the Republican to be the president, Democrat. And they went and knocked on the doors of 30 Americans, distinguished Americans. Not one was willing to do it. I don't know why. I think they just took, is it feasible? Can I win? Where's the money going to come from? There are a lot of different reasons why it's hard. We've historically been a two-party nation. And frankly, I think we ought to be, I'm among those who believe we ought to be spending our time on fixing the problem, and not what's, and not, if we can get by without having a third party, I'd go ahead and get it done. The main thing is, what we need to do is get this economy moving, have the equity and all these other issues that are out there. HS
wants to know, how much does social media impact the decline in leadership that we're seeing?
You got some good questions. What we've learned is that social media is a two-edged sword. And first we saw all the positive upsides that so many people could get access to a national conversation. They could raise their voices, they could tweet, they could get their views put out there, and they could build a following. And so, that was very democratic. And I think but now, of course, they're spewing all this disinformation and nobody knows what to do about it. I don't think anybody has a good solution to it. It's one of those problems right now it's hard to fix. I assume with technological improvements over time, they will come when we can, the these different tech giants can keep the dirt and the bad behavior off the air. I assume that day is coming, but we sure can't come fast enough.
Paul wants to know, what are your thoughts about civics education? Is it effective? And if not, how do you improve it?
Yeah, I do. Sandra Day O'Connor was a big fan of civic education. You know, she spent the last years of her life working hard to bring a change, and I think it's I think we owe it to our kids to have them know and understand the history of the country, both the triumph but the scandals. And we've done wondrous things as a people. We can celebrate that, but we've also done pretty horrible things as a people, and we need to correct that. So I think we're denying our own children an understanding of the country that's been the most successful in the history of the world. And they really need and deserve to have a chance to understand it.
Very quickly, I think Carol wants to know, do Vista and Americorps still exist?
Up to Americorps and this.
And Vista, do they still exist?
Yeah, Americorps does exist. It's an umbrella organization, which is why I don't hear about it. Where you have a group that say this thing takes off in LA on the arts and music. There's going to be some sort of group and that sort of thing that will try to implement that. So Americorps is sort of like an umbrella over a lot of good social entrepreneurs, as they're called, or social enterprises. And Vista is another. Vista Americorps is still out there pretty vibrant. Vista has fallen into more disuse. In order to make these work, it's going to take some political muscle. And I had hoped that President Biden would be very involved in Americorps by now. Jeff Koons, who's a neighbor of his, they're good friends. Koons is a big supporter of national service, and has increased the amount of money that's going into it. But the Biden administration, for reasons I don't understand, has been reluctant to grab hold of this and run with it. I actually think it's something that Republicans and Democrats could do together. It's one of the few things that will work on a bipartisan basis. So we just, again, you've got to have the willpower to get these things done. You can't just talk about them.
We got about 3 minutes left. When we started, somebody said, at the end of the program, you can say anything you want. 3 minutes is an eternity on CNN. You got it all. Take it.
Well, I just want to emphasize once again, the people shouldn't bet against America. One of the things that historians tell us, like a John Meacham, who's my favorite these days, or Doris Kearns Goodwin is so wonderful. What they tell us is we've had existential threats to the country before. Meacham was tell you there have been 4. In the beginning of the Republic, when George Washington was the head of our troops, he fought 8 battles over time, lost 6 out of 8. He was on the ropes. Looked like the whole Republic might collapse. They rallied and pulled it off. Civil War came along, and it was a close call in the Civil War. I was just up at Gettysburg, walking about Gettysburg battlefields, and had things gone just slightly differently, the Union would have lost Gettysburg, and would have lost the war, and then slavery would have continued going for God knows how long. So that was the second one. The third one was the Great Depression, which we've talked about with FDR and how he rallied the country in the way he did, became a big leader. And the fourth was Second World War. In all of those cases, it's Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. Those are your 3 great presidents, and they got us through. Why are they great? Because they got us through some terrible calamities. But to go back to it, calamities are often what actually, at the end of the day, lift matters. Now, Abigail Adams, the wonderful Abigail Adams, wrote a letter to their teenage son, John Quincy Adams, and which is really important here. And she said, adversity is what makes people stronger. From adversity for a country emerged the great statesman and the noble leaders of their time. And so I understand we're going through a rough time now, but from this can come the emergence of a new generation of Americans, younger generations, who disagree with each other on a wide range of things, but agree to work together. That is possible. That's still within our reach. And if we use these next few years wisely and help this younger generation blossom, we're going to be in great shape as a people. If we just sort of go to sleep or say it's hopeless, if we retreat, it's going to collapse. So we got a choice. That's why I think it's so relevant that you're in your community efforts, you're calling this a crossroads. It is a crossroads, and you're wise to recognize it.
Well, thank you, David, very much for your wisdom and for being with us for this hour. It's been great to talk with you, and many
Right.
thanks on behalf of America at a Crossroads.
Okay.
Next
thank-
week, in another week, Bill Crystal is going to be here with the publisher of The Bulwark and also head of Republicans for the Rule of Law, Sarah Longwell, and their topic is Swing Voters. Where does the balance of power lie? That's next Wednesday, August 20th at 5 o'clock Pacific time. In the meantime, stay healthy, stay safe, and thanks a lot for being with us.